From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
If you live in the Wichita School District, there's a question the school wants you to answer. We'll explain what it means. Plus, inflation continues to rise, as do interest rates. But what does that have to do with election season? And from polls to fundraising totals, the numbers that may or may not give us a clue as to what to expect on Tuesday. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Who's got the advantage going into election night? It's the question many voters are asking, and the KSN Emerson College poll released this week gives us one look at possible answers. We start with KSN's Jonathan Ketz.
Incumbent Governor Laura Kelly has a 3 percentage point lead over current Attorney General Derek Schmidt, 46 to 43%, while independent Dennis Pyle has about 5% of the support. 4% of voters are still undecided.
I think it's kind of locked in, and we'll see which side can get out their vote.
Spencer Kimball is the executive director of Emerson College Polling. 52% of undecideds are leaning towards Kelly, while 22% are leaning towards Schmidt.
What's interesting is she's competing in a Republican state as a Democrat, and if she was to actually win the race, I think it would be a gold star for the Democratic Party, considering what they're looking at in other parts of the country.
Candidate Dennis Pyle is playing an interesting role in this race, too. He left the Republican Party in June to run as an independent candidate. Kimball says the 5% he's garnering is the difference in this race.
The conventional wisdom would be if you've got a Republican third party, if that candidate stays in, that should help the Democrat. If that candidate was to leave, their vote would ideologically fall more with the Republican per se. But in the state of Kansas, Kelly's been able to stake out that moderate position. And these voters clearly have some trepidation for going with Schmidt. And that might be enough for them to switch over to Kelly.
And the race for Attorney General may be even closer than the race for governor. Democrat Chris Mann leads Republican Chris Kobach in the poll 44 to 43%. But in that race, 11% of voters are still undecided. So now, seriously, how seriously should we take these numbers? That's just one of the questions I'm posing to our panel this week. We have with us Jackson Overstreet, political reporter at Cake TV. And also we have political analyst Dr. Russell Arbin Fox from Friends University. And Russell, I'm going to start with you. How seriously should we take these numbers? A lot of people don't trust polls anymore.
There's a lot of reasons to be worried about polls, even though tremendous amounts of effort and thought and science goes in to trying to deal with the changing landscape. Nonetheless, those landscape changes are real. It's difficult to contact people by phone. It's difficult to deal with the fact that a lot of people, as you just noted, don't trust polls, and so therefore they don't respond to them. And the pollsters have to try to anticipate for that. So there's a huge amount of variables that are difficult to nail down when it comes to polling. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't take them seriously as a snapshot that maybe kind of gives us a general outline, but at this point, we really shouldn't take a look at any particular poll as some kind of, gospel message.
Now, even if, like Emerson College, it's a group that has a fairly successful poll
they're
rate.
A good group. And so, you take a look at that and you recognize the fact that, they have a lot of the people that I just mentioned that are doing the hard work, that are running the models, that are testing things out, that are looking at past poll results and measuring them against election results and trying to come up with some estimates that fit into the changing demographics. We should take this poll more seriously than we should take something that comes out of BuzzFeed or for example. But nonetheless, these people, just like all other reputable pollers, are struggling to deal with changes in technology, changes in demographics, changes in the American attitude towards polling. They're trying to capture all of that. And so those are some variables that are very difficult to nail down.
Yeah. Talking about variables difficult to nail down exactly what voters are thinking. You've been speaking with a lot of voters this last week. This poll, not that different from one we saw a few weeks ago. How do those polls seem to be correlating with what you're hearing from voters as you speak with them?
I do my best when I talk to them. I don't really ask who they vote for, but you can kind of get a sense about how they answer. There's people who answer, I just want complete change, or there are people who say, There's one guy I talked to who said, I think we've been kind of misled. Things are not as bad as we think. That kind of gives me the indication that, that's probably maybe a Kelly voter. But you just had the situation to where there's a lot on voters' minds. There's a lot out there. But I really think when you look at it, the biggest things that come to them, and this is what most of the voters I've asked when I asked them about the kind of the topics that lead into the polls, one has said, the judges, which I thought was interesting, but the big ones have been the economy and abortion. Those are still the two kind of driving topics, which is really interesting kind of in light of the Value Them Both amendment. And then there's one man I interviewed who said, I want to reinforce my vote. And that's why he came out to early vote, was to reinforce the vote he had on August 2nd.
Can I ask you one thing real quick? Have you met a pile voter? Because I've met them online, but I don't think I've ever met one in person.
I have not met anyone who's given me any indication that it'd be a pile voter. So far, it's been either I kind of feel it'd be Schmidt or it would be Kelly.
I mean, one of the really interesting things about this poll, and we talked about it before, was that when you have a candidate that very clearly has no chance of winning the election, you find that a lot of their support kind of fades away as you come close to election day, as people return home to their parties. But Pyle has actually increased his percentage. Now, again, there's all these variables that we're not certain of regarding the polling, so we don't know how much we should trust it. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that surely there were people on the Schmidt side that were expecting the Pyle phenomenon to kind of fade away, and it absolutely hasn't, or at least it does not appear to be. And that has to be worrisome to them.
And one race that we haven't really talked a whole lot about, the Attorney General's race. And it's one that's not gotten as much attention, but seems to be even tighter, even more competitive than the governor's race. As you've been speaking with voters there, Jackson, are they even aware really of the Attorney General's race? Are they thinking about that as they're going to the polls?
I think that's kind of the interesting point, is that, and we've talked about this at the station, is that Mann hasn't run a really kind of campaign with a lot of big ad buys or anything like that. Kobach has to some point, but I really think that one's going to come down to a lot more of name recognition, people knowing, instead of positive name recognition, just kind of knowing, okay, I've seen Kobach's name before, I'm going to vote against it. I think that's what we're honestly going to see from a lot of voters, that they just make the choice of who I don't want to vote for, not who I want to vote for.
I agree completely. Yeah.
Interesting point there. And another set of numbers that matters a lot, not the poll numbers, but fundraising numbers, can really tell us what to expect on Tuesday. We got a peek at those this week, the last peek before voters hit the polls. Rebecca Chung of the KSN Capitol Bureau breaks them down for us.
Well, these numbers could hint at how much Democrats will need to stay competitive in a Republican state. Looking at the latest campaign finance reports, we see that Democrats in both races for governor and attorney general have nearly doubled what their competitors have made. Democrats are raking in cash for top statewide races. In the race for Kansas governor, Democratic incumbent Laura Kelly has brought in about $3.1 million, according to the latest campaign finance report. That's almost double what Republican Derek Schmidt has raised, which is about $1.7 million.
Even though Derek Schmidt didn't raise as much money as Laura Kelly, he's gotten a lot of help from outside groups to the tune of double-digit millions of dollars. So that helps make it a little more of an even playing field.
In the attorney general race, Democrat Chris Mann has also raised nearly twice as much as Republican Chris Kobach. Mann's raking in almost $1 million. Meanwhile, Kobach has raised about $465,000.
Chris Mann had to raise money because nobody knew who he was. Chris Kobach, everybody knows who he is. Chris Mann raised enough money to get his name out there.
Both races also appear to be tight. From our last poll back in September, Kelly holds a narrow lead in the race for governor, leading Schmidt by just 2 percentage points. The same goes for Kobach in the attorney general race, leading Mann at 41% to 39%. We teamed up with Emerson College Polling and The Hill once again to get the latest numbers in these races. We're also taking a look at where voters stand on key issues like student loans and marijuana. That's coming up in our latest poll Wednesday morning at 6. For now, reporting at the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
And of course, we saw those latest poll numbers there off the top of the show. Yes. But as we look at this issue, you were bringing up a point as we were listening to that story about how interesting those ad buys are.
Yeah, because we just don't know where money is going to, at least here in the Wichita market, because we're not having these big ad buys here. And so maybe he's focusing a lot more of that attention in the Kansas City area, in Lawrence, where he's from, trying to really bring out a lot of people out there. Because down here, I mean, I've seen a few Kobach ads and especially anti-man ads from supporters of Kobach, but it's really been a much more governor-focused race here in Sedgwick County, which I think makes sense because you see a lot of the governor's race kind of really depending on the turnout of Sedgwick County and kind of might swap it. And it looks like an attorney general, they're thinking somewhere different.
So, I mean, you can see a certain amount of logic to it, and I don't have access to whatever kind of internal information that they're sharing, in the campaigns. But from the outside, you can make the argument that, well, of course, Mann will get the Democratic vote. He'll get the portion of independents who are strongly anti-Kobach. And then he needs to win over Republicans who also don't like Kobach. In other words, he's got to win over moderate Republicans. Now, there's not a whole lot of moderate Republicans left, but if there are any left, where are they most likely to be found? They're most likely to be found in the Kansas City suburbs. They're most likely to be found in, kind of northeast Kansas. So maybe that's where you're seeing most of his ad money go. Another thing that is worth thinking about just generally, it wasn't too many election cycles ago when you had Democrats in general, on both the state level and the national level, assuming that they were in a permanent fundraising disadvantage. And then over the course of the 2000s, that completely changed. Part of it was technology. Part of it was new methods of raising money that were pioneered by people like Howard Dean and then, of course, Barack Obama. And now Democrats regularly outraise Republicans. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're winning all of these elections, because at a certain point, the marginal effect of every dollar you raise is getting pretty small. But still, it's no longer a surprise to have a Democrat be able to outraise a Republican opponent, because they can advertise this nationally as standing up against Trump, standing up against Kobach, standing up against fascism or whatever. I look forward to seeing the breakdown that shows how much of their money was raised in Kansas and how much of it was outside Kansas donations.
Well, and getting back to where that money is being spent, whether we're talking about the governor's race or the attorney general's or even not the Secretary of State's, what's the other? Is the state treasurer's
Right.
race, which is the other one where we saw the Democrat raising more money than the Republican in that race. I'm wondering how much of it has to do with the fact that, as much as we love TV, because that's where we're at right now, most people just don't spend as much time on TV as they used to. They're spending their time on social media. And I don't know about you guys, but every time I'm on social media, it's political ad after political ad after political ad. And so I think they're spending more money there.
You were talking about how you hadn't seen a lot of Chris Mann ads. And that's true on television or on billboards or anywhere else. But on social media, yeah, I've seen them. I've seen all of this stuff.
And I would also say I think we shouldn't discount other mediums, either print or radio. I know a lot of times during the Value Them Both vote and all that stuff, I heard a ton of radio ads and all that. And so, as much as we love to talk about TV and its influential power, there are other mediums to get your message out of.
Exactly. Well, talking about getting the message out, thought we were done with numbers? Not quite yet. This last number involves a federal interest rate hike, part of an attempt to control inflation. But will it also play a role in the coming week's votes here in Kansas? KX Jackson Overstreet asked around.
What goes through the average voter's mind when they're filling out their ballot? Is it the political party, maybe an issue like healthcare or education, or a specific candidate that they think is just nicer than the other? For Teresa Rose, one of the big ones was the economy.
The inflation and the interest rates and all of that. We just need somebody that's going to speak for us people.
The economy is historically the issue that wins or loses elections, according to political experts. So with the Federal Reserve announcing Wednesday that it is again raising interest rates as a way to try to lower high inflation, how could this potentially swing some close races in Kansas?
This is an adjustment that I think is coming too late in the election season.
Friends University political science professor Dr. Russell Arbin Fox says that with less than a week to go, a lot of the narratives about the economy are pretty well set.
If this had happened 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, it probably could have entered into the churn.
On top of that, Dr. Fox says the rate hike is also more of a national economy talking point. And Governor Laura Kelly has done a good job of distancing herself from national issues and Democratic politicians like the president.
The baseline isn't national inflation rates, the baseline isn't President Biden in Washington, D.C. The baseline is school closures in 2017 and budget problems 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Now, of course, you were in that story. That was a few days ago. This is that time of year when we are all over the place on elections, and we are waiting to talk about something else, but not today.
The only thing that I would add to what I said there is that, you had mentioned before, it's the economy and abortion that's motivating people. Let's think about which sorts of voters seem to be most motivated by those sorts of things. So, if you are talking about low-income voters, if you're talking about people that are really struggling to make their budgets, to pay the grocery bills, then any kind of bad economic news, even if it's one that really won't affect them, I guess you could understand that entering into the narrative. But if you're talking about someone who, basically they've got a stable job and they don't like inflation, but it's not breaking their back, this is the sort of news that's just going to wash over them because they're going to be more concerned about abortion issues. They're going to be more concerned about other things like that. So, I stand by what I said there, but let's also bring in the fact that different people are going to internalize news in different ways.
And I think the voter that you heard me talk to there is kind of a good example of the voters who might think about this. She really, when I asked her, was like, one of the things I'm asking about today is kind of, how is the economy kind of playing a role in your vote? She said it is the biggest thing for her. She talked about inflation. She talked about the rate hikes. Basically said, I just can't buy things as cheap as I have been before. I'm stretching every dollar as much more. That was her number one concern. And she talked about, specifically, she kind of alluded to having taxes being lowered and having more of that money in her own pocket. So I think that kind of leads to, those voters are out there, they're probably going to lean more toward Schmidt because even though Kelly has talked about axing the food tax and stuff like that, I think you naturally assume the Republican candidate is going to lower taxes a little bit more with that preconception.
I appreciate you bringing that up because I think that's a question that hasn't been asked. I don't think Kelly got a whole lot of mileage out of the food tax thing. I don't think it's really been prominent in anybody's narrative.
Well, and I think that was by design, because she wanted the food tax axed immediately. In fact, she's still pushing for that and saying that we need to do that next session. But the Republicans in the House and in the Senate said, no, we're going to spread it out over 3 years. Mm-hmm. The reasoning that was voiced was that was because they needed time to make sure we actually had the money to pay for it.
Right.
But if you look at state finances, we've got plenty of surplus in the budget. We've got more than enough surplus in the budget to pay for it. And pretty much everyone I've spoken with on both sides of the aisles, when they're not in front of the camera, has either explicitly or tacitly admitted that it was about denying the governor a win on that one.
And it was successful because even though Kelly's people have regularly mentioned that, it's not being experienced by voters. Yeah. And so therefore, how much mileage can you get out of it anyway?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is we did see early on in the governor's race, right after August, right after the August primary, where there was a lot of talk about, the governor voted down, vetoed. That's what I'm looking for.
Vetoed all these tax breaks.
All these, 20 different tax cuts.
Yeah.
And the governor's saying, I cut taxes for you. I lowered the burden.
Right.
So maybe it comes down to who wins that early argument.
And I think this is the last real interesting point about this is that, and this is not Kelly's fault, she has tried to cut taxes as a Democrat. I think there's a national perception as Democrats raise taxes, Republicans cut taxes from national politics, and I think it just kind of seeps down in here even as hard as she tries to kind of pitch a different idea of herself.
Yeah.
Fair.
All right, well, moving on from the governors and other statewide races, we have, along with those typical races, if you live in the Wichita School District, also a question about how you want to pick your school board members. KSN's Eddie Randall shows us what it means.
The USD 259 Board of Education represents students and families in Wichita Public Schools. Right now, anyone can vote for any seat in the general election. There's an argument that the current system disenfranchises voters from poor neighborhoods. USD 259 is broken up into 6 districts. These are the numbers of registered voters by district, according to the election office. District 3 and 4 have 26 and 28,000 voters respectively, but District 2 in East Wichita has roughly 43,000 voters. District 5 in West Wichita has almost 35,000 voters. These two areas could dominate in an at-large general election. In August, the Board of Education approved a motion for change, giving voters in November's general election the power to choose whether to keep the old system or change it to where people vote only for the school board seat representing their district. To sum it all up, voting yes on the USD 259 school board ballot question would change the process in the future, letting voters only choose the person representing the district they live in. A no vote would keep the system the same.
And this is a vote that has kind of been incremental over the last 3-4 decades, really. As you were covering this, of course, there's District 1, Brandon Johnson, others from that district leadership have really been pushing this change because they're kind of the ones who are a lot smaller.
Yes, and a lot of it talked about, I know I spoke with someone who's kind of behind the push here locally for this vote. I believe it's Our District, Our Vote. LaWanda DeShazer, member of the NAACP, they have this big coalition together, United Teachers Union, a lot of other groups out pushing for this, and basically said, we just want it to be the same thing throughout because we want our districts to be truly represented by people who come from these districts. I asked her a little bit about District 1 with the school board, which 2 elections ago had, I believe, Betty Arnold, black woman who lost very narrowly to Ben Blankley. Ben, as she talked about, was very involved with the community, did a great job of representing that area. He then lost in this last push election last year, I believe, to Diane Albert, if I remember the progression correctly. But this was one of the Republicans that was pushed through the election last year. And so this wasn't necessarily an attack on her, but what they're saying is that, because we had this citywide vote on these candidates, Ben lost a very close race. And they think if it had just been district only for that race, he probably would have won. I think they did some vote analysis where it actually would have shown that.
No. And it also, too, goes back to the history of why we elect it this way. I mean, if you look at city council, we elect in pretty much any city, really. You don't elect all of your members in the city council at large. You elect them by district. If you live in this district, you vote for the candidate in this district and that candidate only. And there's a reason for that. It's the same thing for congressional districts and the Senate. If you live in this state, you only vote for your state's candidates. This is different, and perhaps, well, we know, not perhaps, we do know the history of it. It goes back to 1906 when they first went to at-large votes. It was part of a move. This is when Ku Klux Klan was the strongest in Kansas at its height. It was an idea that came up from Texas, and it was to control the black vote, to suppress the power, the growing power of the black vote as more and more blacks were moving into Kansas at the time.
And I think even if people don't know that history, and most of us didn't, I didn't know that history until this issue finally came forward as a matter of public discussion. Even if they don't know that history, Americans have, generally speaking, absorbed the kind of democratic logic, small d democratic logic that you were talking about. Like in this district, you vote on these candidates. In this state, you vote on those candidates. There are a lot of kind of anti-democratic, counter-majoritarian elements of our system that maybe in a broader historical, philosophical sense you can make a good case for, but it's pretty difficult to defend them in the face of the basic democratic logic that so many people have accepted. I mean, a lot of people are accepting of the way redistricting happens, but you bet that if redistricting was actually put up for a popular vote, it would look very, very different. Yeah. So now, because of the certain circumstances of state law, this is able to come up for a popular vote, and I'm pretty certain it's going to pass easily.
Well, and I was going to say just real quick, the 2 voters I talked to, they saw this, they had no idea this was on the ballot, and when they read it, it was like, yeah, this makes sense. This is what we should be voting for. As simple as that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll have to see how voters vote on Tuesday. Finally today, if you're a registered voter, you may have gotten misleading text messages this week about where to vote. So misleading, the Secretary of State issued a warning about the text. Let's go to KSN's Samantha Boring for the details.
I was just really confused.
Josh Purdy is just one of many Sedgwick County voters who received this text message.
They both gave me my correct home address, but then the voting location was like 20 minutes away.
Sedgwick County voter Carla Thompson also got the text.
I thought it was strange because the voting location that they sent me along with the picture wasn't the voting location I went to last time.
Both voters decided to double check their polling location through the official Secretary of State election website.
I didn't think mine changed, and I looked, and mine hadn't changed from where it normally is.
Purdy and Thompson say they've never voted at the location given to them in the text. The Sedgwick County Election Office sharing it is not sending texts out regarding the election or polling places. Both voters say they hope others do their due diligence and do not fall for the misinformation.
Research their polling station and not, believe everything that they get.
Secretary of State Scott Schwab warning about these text messages. In a statement, he said, quote, voters should be on high alert for these messages. He added the Secretary of State's office does not use third parties to contact voters or share election information on our behalf. The best advice is you need to confirm your polling place before you vote next Tuesday, and we have how to do so on KSN.com. Here for you in Wichita, Samantha Boring, KSN News 3.
And I guess we really shouldn't be surprised at some of these shenanigans based on what we're seeing nationwide going on.
No, of course not. The one thing that I would like to keep in mind is that this is actually a civic success story. This is somebody getting a text, recognizing that this information is false or at least suspicious. They follow up on it. This is the news media getting information out. This is the Secretary of State's office doing what they're supposed to be doing, actually paying attention to these things. Obviously we should be worried about, people acting in this kind of fraudulent manner, sending out this kind of false information, but we should also be, kind of feeling good about the fact that people were recognizing it and responding to it in an effective way.
And also social media. One voter I talked to, he got the same text. He thought it was correct. He's like, I just moved to this new place. This is great. I don't have to check it. He saw on Reddit and on Twitter that this was going around, and he went back and checked this and found it was a different location. I will say, from what I did, because I report on the story as well, the three groups that are involved with this, it was an error from the vendor. They sent out the wrong list and all that, and so they sent out texts to try to correct it, and so they try to even fix their own mistake. So hopefully it doesn't send too many people to the wrong place. But yeah, I think to your point, this is a great example of people getting out in front and every medium possible to say, check your ballot and check where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right.
And a great example of social media is not always bad. Sometimes it has a redeeming value or two. Well, Jackson, Russell, thank you both so much for joining us this week. And thank you as well. We'd also like to thank our news partners, the Wichita Eagle, KSN News, and Cake News, for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to continue this conversation with you. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or PBS Kansas on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. In the meantime, stay safe, have a great week, and don't forget to vote.